I thought it'd be worthwhile to discuss omega-3s and why anytime there's a new controversial publication, study, epidemiological study, and so on, it creates this rift of, is it really good for us? Are they necessary? Are they essential? Is the role that they play something that we need to be concerned about? And what I want to describe to you today is overwhelmingly the answer is yes, 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 yes. They are absolutely a phenomenal compound. Omega-3s are elegant. They are involved in so many of our biological and physiological processes that we want to pay attention to these things. We want to make sure that we're getting high enough levels. We want to make sure we're supporting the omega-3 biochemistry. We're wanting to make sure that our omega-3s are they run across the spectrum. There's a number of varieties of omega-3s. And we want to do that in the context of other omegas, our omega-6s, 9s, some other unique fatty acids and lipids. These are all important to our health. And at any given time, I don't want some questionable study, or at least a study that may be looking at a particular aspect or doesn't include enough data to make informed decisions, to derail us from what I would tell you is the global data, the overwhelming decades worth of omega-3 research, as well as large cohort studies from epidemiological to randomized controlled trials. The overwhelming conclusion, or the evidence, is they are absolutely beneficial. And we can reduce that into context as well. They're beneficial with our cardiovascular system, with our neurological, with our liver, our gut health, our skin. So it doesn't mean that every system is going to simply respond to omega-3s in isolation, but absolutely in the context of the nutritional profile, omega-3s play a very particular and important role in our general health. And I don't want anything to derail our knowledge, our education of it, and our understanding of the outcomes of many of our research studies to diminish the importance of these things. And again, in context, there's so many benefits, and I want to go through some of those today. So to begin with, let's talk about there's pathways that they impact. There are mechanisms that we understand, and I'll get into those in a little bit more. But the structure of them, I want to kind of just give you a little bit of background on omega-3s. So omega-3s are what we consider, they're fatty acids. They come in a number of forms, the mainly triglyceride form, but there is a phospholipid form, there's free fatty acids. Triglycerides and phospholipids are the most bioavailable, coming from either fish or algae, and then the phospholipid form is typically found in krill or shellfish. And these can be done, you can consume these as foods or as supplements. Now, what a fatty acid is, most of us are familiar with fatty acids because there are many that we consume that are converted into energy. And they're a long carbon chain and with an acid on the end. And that's the fat part is the long carbon chain. And these carbon chains have numerous permutations. They can be completely unsaturated, which means they're all just carbon hydrogen in their carbon. And they can be anywhere from 4 carbons to 40 carbons as you get into waxes. But in the fatty acid profile, and especially in omega-3s, they tend to be C18, C20, and C22. And it's these three that we most commonly refer to. The first omega-3 being alpha-linolenic acid, and that comes from plants. The second being DHA and EPA, second and third. Now, DHA is 22 carbon long and EPA is 20 carbons long. They also include what we call double bonds. Now, I'm not going to get into the chemistry of this, but these double bonds impart structure. They give the characteristics of these fatty acids in our tissues and in our membranes that are useful and helpful. Now, it also creates a potential for oxidation. Double bonds can be oxidized. And that tends to be one of the concerns that nutritionists and scientists and clinicians alike, we don't want to see too much oxidation of our omega-3s. And there are ways that we can protect that. Now, on the other side, there are omega-6 fatty acids that have a very similar description. They can be 18 carbon long, 20 and 22, and they also contain double bonds. And the interesting thing, and really the fascination that I want to get into here regarding omega-3s is the omega-3 journey and the omega-6 journey are very different in our bodies and in each cell. So when we think of these lipids, these fatty acids, they have such a unique journey and a unique implication in our health and in our function of cellular behavior, hormonal behavior, and where they actually create their benefits. That's a unique way to look at these lipids, and perhaps more importantly, we don't want to simply think of them as a lipid or a fat compound. They're actually providing very important benefits and very different complex benefits, and they're in many ways synergistic. So the journey that omega-3s take is very complementary to the journey that omega-6s take, and that's why we always talk about them oftentimes in the same conversation, because they have different roles, but those roles are very complementary. But omega-3s in particular, when we think of this idea of them being essential, is they're not, strictly speaking, an essential compound. So EPA and DHEA can be produced by our body from alpha-linoleic acid, or ALA. So by consuming plant lipids, then you'll be getting some ALA that can be converted into DHA and EPA. But the reality of that is it's at a very, very low level, maybe 5 to 10% on a very good mechanistic system or a very good metabolism. However, consuming them exogenously, so from fish or krill, is the ideal way to raise the omega-3 levels. And we can't just rely, and I'll get into some of the reasons why that transformation or that synthesis of omega-3, DHA, and EPA isn't as robust as we'd like it to be. And we've always had a relationship with fish and plants, and so this idea of us consuming them shouldn't be foreign to us, and it shouldn't be something that we think we can circumvent. Eating these compounds has been and always will be providing the major benefit of these omega-3s. And so I mentioned they come in different forms from the different sources, whether it be fish or krill. And one of the considerations that we will talk about a little bit later is the source of fish, the source of shellfish, because we want to make sure we're choosing the right sources as we consume these plants, or even from our supplement side, where the source is coming from. It matters quite a bit. One of the myths that gets created because of the conversations around diet and omegas, omega-6s, 3s, and 9s, is that we don't need to eat fish. We can eat dairy. We can eat other meats, grass-fed beef, which I'm all for. I mean, eating an omnivore diet's a fantastic way to go. Even if you look at the Mediterranean diet, it does include fish, just keep in mind. We want to eat seeds. We want to eat whole foods, whole vegetables, whole fruits, grains, legumes, healthy grains, by the way. And the fact is, none of these contain DHA or EPA. We can get an ample source of ALA from all of these other products, all these other whole foods, but no EPA and DHA. And that's kind of a myth. I hear people saying, well, I just consume more of these things and I'm going to have my levels of DHA and EPA. And there's really no evidence, no significant evidence for that happening. We have to consume either DHA foods or DHA supplementation. And they both work really well at bringing up blood levels of these things. Now, there's a couple of ways in which people like to discuss these omega situations, and that is we can do testing and look at omega-3 and 6 indexes And these indices are very important. Highly recommend that because it tells you exactly where you are on your omega-3 and omega-6 levels. And then you can monitor this and compare it to where optimal levels should be. There's a few other mathematics that have been applied, like, for example, this ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 or omega-3 to omega-6. And this is an outdated way of looking at it because there are so many ratios. For example, if we have a 1-to-1 ratio, which means we're consuming the same amounts of omega-6s and omega-3s, that would be a 1-to-1. If we're consuming 5 times the amount of omega-6s that we are to omega-3s, that would be a 5-to-1. And so there's very little information in that because it's the absolute amount of omega-3s and 6s we're consuming. The ratios can be manipulated. If I'm only consuming a very small of amount of omega-3 and omega-6, I'm not getting the health benefits even though my ratio is beautiful. So keep in mind that knowing the amounts we're consuming and the amounts that we can find in tissue, specifically blood, and the byproducts, that tells us so much more than just considering ratios. So it is a bit of an outdated concept because it can be manipulated. You can be at a 1-to-1, but be nowhere near your significant levels of omega-3 and omega-6. So I just wanted to touch on that because that's one of the conversations that comes up quite often. And because of that, because of understanding that we have to have greater levels of omega-3s and 6s in our body, and omega-3s in particular because they're harder to come by, is because of what they do. And so many systems are impacted by omega-3s. Now, first and foremost, these omega-3s find their way into our cellular membranes. So once we consume them, they're quickly shuttled into cellular membranes. What do they do in our membranes and why do we want them there? Well, they have a remarkable impact on cellular membranes. They create this flexibility. They make the membrane more fluid. This allows the membrane to move items in and out, meaning that they can bring good compounds into the cell and remove waste from the cell much more efficiently than a rigid membrane that doesn't have as much omega-3 content. They allow the receptors to be more stimulated and have the signaling from receptors be more functional and more active, which helps us with our hormone reception and the translation of this information into the cell. Omega-3s can create synaptic plasticity in the neurological and brain system. They're involved in neurogenesis. Now, when you're developing baby in utero, DHA is absolutely essential for brain development. So that's a key note there where your brain requires DHA for optimal and proper functioning. Helps with neurogenesis, neurotransmission, myelination. It protects glial cells. Glial cells kind of protect the neurons. In our immune system, it's critical for our immune system protection and really the operation of the immune system properly. Because I'll get to a graphic later that I'll show you where, within the last, I would say, decade, we've really started to understand how omega-3s are converted to what we call resolvins, protectins, and magnesium. These are selective resolvin metabolites, and they resolve inflammation. So inflammation is an active process. So we want inflammation to rise under a threat. That's injury, pathogen, and some other issue going on. We want that inflammation cascade to rise to protect us, but then we want it to resolve. Well, resolution is no longer thought of as a passive process. It's an active process. And one of the ways in which it's actively reduced is through omega-3 conversion into these protective mediators called resolvins, protectins, and magnesiums. So having enough omega-3 around, DHA and EPA, allows your immune system to resolve inflammation. And I can't tell you how many chronic and degenerative diseases require this resolution, or they are not performing that resolution properly, which means omega-3 plays a critical role in that. And that's an important aspect of why we need our omega-3s to be at a high enough level. Of course, they're critical in our liver function, and I mentioned this already, but fetal and infant development. They're absolutely necessary for proper skin and mucosal function. They work through inflammatory responses. They help all of the tight junctions properly. They help us regulate the types of sebum we produce and the quality of mucosal membranes. They're necessary for this. They're involved in joint health, right? Joint stiffness, lubrication, and again, the inflammatory and pain triggers in our joints. So part of this inflammatory response is the level of EPA and DHA can mitigate pain. The higher the levels, the more they can be converted into these resolvins, and pain can be reduced. So they're involved in pain. They're involved in hormone functions. Without a question, there's a really important signaling that goes on, and it involves DHA and EPA. And this signaling for hormones, I mentioned that omega-6 and omega-3 take different journeys. Many of our signaling compounds, including some hormonal compounds, are derived from, or at least adjunct to this, derivatives are used to create hormones or to create hormone signaling. And so this impact on our hormone function is clearly mitigated and or influenced by our levels of omega-3s and circulating in our body and impacting our membranes. And as I mentioned before, this hormone piece can influence all kinds of decisions, whether they be metabolic decisions, neurological decisions, cardiovascular decisions. These are decisions that hormones are helping the cells make to provide us the proper responses, the proper nutrients, and the proper metabolic outcomes, for example. So there's a hormone relationship which we do not want to overlook. And these are all critical aspects of the overall journey that omega-3s make in our tissue. And using a more complex graph here, then we can break this down and why these omega-3s are involved in so many processes, and we understand the mechanisms. So I want to maybe jump back to my original argument, or my original proposal was they're critical in so many ways, even if we don't have all of the clinical data or all of the detailed data around the physiology. What we do know is by looking at where the omega-3s play a role and what they're converted into and how they stimulate and reduce oxidative stress, the neuroendocrine pathways, inflammatory pathways, the cognitive pathways, the cardiovascular benefits, and these are impacted not necessarily in a way that I want to say, well, DHA finds its way to this particular tissue and performs this particular job. It does many of those things, but where the phenomenon, or where the brilliance and the elegance of these omega-3 molecules play a role is they work along all those pathways. So, for example, they can stimulate resistance of cells to stress, or they can help microglias perform better, or create neurotransmitter releases through signaling. They can stimulate cell proliferation or apoptosis, growth development, clearly. They can regulate gene expression. So metabolites can regulate gene expression, which of course is critical for just about everything we do each day. They can regulate signaling molecules. They can improve the capacity of cells to manage stress, antioxidant, the mitochondrial processes. They seem to work in conjunction with, and I'm going to jump to this in a minute, but they don't do this in isolation, of course. There's many enzymes involved. There's micronutrients. We want to be cognizant of our levels of B vitamins, our levels of micro minerals, zinc, calcium, magnesium, cobalt, etc. These are all also part of this journey. Now, there are plant compounds, polyphenols, that are now playing a more significant role in DHA outcomes, EPA outcomes, and the way in which they work within our cells and within our hormonal and neurological gut responses. So in summary, what I'd really like to impress upon you is, before I touch on some of the more notable and larger clinical studies, even beyond that, the idea or the understanding of how these omega-3s are involved in so many cellular mechanisms, enzymatic processes, that this understanding far outpaces how we can look at it clinically on the outcome. And the only way we can do that, of course, that's forthcoming, and we will continue to follow the research and follow the studies. But the exciting part for me, and the part that I want to really get across to everyone, is we know what they're being turned into. We know how these impact us physiologically. We know all of the different roles they play, and they're critical and important and phenomenal and meaningful roles that omega-3s play. I don't ever want to undermine that by saying, well, there's not a clinical study that supports that, or there's not a evidentiary or an outcome, because we're not going to be able to look at all these things that it does and that it is doing. It is an essential part of how our cells function, how our tissues function, even how our microbiome functions. That is the penultimate argument, that they're doing so many things that we just won't be able to, for years to come, won't be able to fully understand them from a disease state or otherwise. But what we do know clinically from the clinical studies that have been done and from the massive epidemiological studies, we're beginning to understand that they are absolutely important. And we're seeing it in observational ways as well as very, very detailed scientific study ways. That's the take home, is that we see all this going on in the cell. We know what they're doing in many ways, and it's absolutely critical and important. That's the take home. The clinical studies are starting to support that, and there's no way to argue out of that. It's a beautiful reason to take our omega-3s and to make sure we understand our omega-3 intake. And of course, we now know from these clinical studies that we've looked at cardiovascular health. There's been some neurological health studies. But what are the impacted people for the most part? Well, to begin with, so to turn this around into what do we do, how do we do it, after looking at these studies, is who's at risk? Well, people that are at risk are people that have been living on an ultra-processed diet. They're not getting nearly their need of omega-3s, DHA, EPA, and even ALA in many cases. So we want to take the at-risk people first and say they can up their levels, and they're going to have significant benefits from that. If you're not eating enough EPA and DHA from fish or shellfish, clearly, or even supplementing it, raise those levels. You're going to get a benefit. Anyone that's, of course, during pregnancy, absolutely beneficial for the brain, no question, no argument. But throughout our lifespan, we want to keep these levels up because they improve our outcomes for all of the measurable the measurable indices for health: cardiovascular, neurological, liver, gut. All these indices benefit from greater intake of omega-3s. And in some of the studies that are more observational, where you measure the omega-3s in people that seem to live longer. So for example, if you look into some of the Japanese studies that looked at, they have a higher level of omega-3s and they tend to live longer than Western diet people by 4 to 5 years on average. If you look at in postmortem brains, Alzheimer's and dementia, there's higher levels of omega-3s in the brain with the disease state than there were with the non-dementia or Alzheimer's postmortem. So these are a couple, but the bigger clinical studies I'll go over briefly. We want to make sure that each and every aspect of our health incorporates some omega-3 in it, along with all of the other nutrients, and I'll get back to that in a second. The pathway that I mentioned that dictates how some of these omega-3s and omega-6s really provide their benefits is shown in this slide, and it underlies some of the new things we've learned about it. I've talked a lot about what the omega-3s do and what they can become. The omega-6s, similarly, they take a very different journey, but they certainly have every bit of the same type of impacts on us. So we want to be consuming both kinds and making sure that we're getting enough levels of both omega-6 and 3s. But particularly on the omega-3 side, what should be mentioned is they don't come from as many food sources or supplements, so we need to be aware of that and consume them. But the journey they take is really, it's made possible through a series of enzyme reactions. So if we go from alpha-linolenic acid to DHA and EPA, there are potentially five different enzyme reactions that take us through that journey. What that means is we start with the ALA, and that needs to be converted by a little machine we call an enzyme to the next step, which is intermediate to the following step, which is then another intermediate, and then we have EPA and DHA. So we have to journey this. Now, that's a lot of work. It requires a lot of energy by the cell. And these enzymes are not always functioning properly for other limiting reasons, not because there's not enough ALA around, but because there may not be enough cofactors around. Cofactors are tools that help the machine. And those cofactors, you will understand clearly, are B vitamins and certain minerals. For example, B6, B3, magnesium, zinc are all involved in how these enzymes perform their duty. And if we're limiting any of those nutrients, we're also limiting the ability to make that transition. Now, secondarily, there's another impact. If we have genetic backgrounds or genetic predispositions where these enzymes don't perform as well as they could because of what we call single nucleotide polymorphisms, there's another way in which we're slowing down the rate at which ALA can be converted to EPA and DHA. And I want to be mindful of these because this is emerging science, and things are not all, we can't simply isolate and just expect the answer to be found. We need to take this consideration of it's a wellness story, not a wellness item, because in the story you've got micronutrients, you've got the EPA, DHA, you've got ALA, you've got your enzymes, you've got your genetic background, and I'm going to layer in the microbiome in a minute. This is the path that I want everybody to consider when they think about or are concerned about a particular item like omega-3s. Omega-3s are an important aspect, but in the context of a lot of other healthy choices that we have to make. By itself, you may not get the outcome you need if you are lacking these other components. This is a critical feature of this wellness concept. I can up my DHA or EPA, and yet I might not be getting the benefit if I don't have these other facets of my health in play, meaning if I don't have enough of my micronutrients, or I don't have enough of my gut biome in a healthy status, or I don't have enough of the other aspects of this journey. It's a more complex story, but it's really easy to break it down and say, whole foods, certain amounts of supplementation, certain amounts of lifestyle behaviors, the exercise, various quality exposures that I'll try to do in a separate video about what we should do about this. But this journey is dictated by a lot of things, including our genetic background as well as our enzyme or our nutrient profiles. Keep that in mind. Because of that, let's finally get to some of the things that the studies have told us, right? So these large studies, many of them have shown a huge benefit to us. Some, moderate to mild, haven't really given us that benefit. But the takeaway from those things, beyond what I've already told you, is there are differences. There are sex differences. Women tend to convert ALA into EPA and DHA better because of the hormone estrogen. And we'll get into the mechanism, but that's something we need to understand. It's something we've learned from these studies. I mentioned the polymorphisms. I want to tell you that you can look into this if you'd like, but two of the enzymes involved in these, the desaturase or elongase process, going from ALA to EPA and DHA, We call them FADS 2 or FADS 1. That's 2 of them. But you can get genetic testing to understand your background or your client's background, for example, to give you some insights into their ability to process ALA to EPA or DHA. And then, of course, there's this competition of the omega-6s with the omega-3s on that journey. Those same enzymes are used to transform both omega-6 and omega-3. And if you are consuming a diet that's extremely high in omega-6s and very low in omega-3s, you're impacting your ability to convert ALA into EPA and DHA. And that's another mindful event that you want to be aware of. And then, of course, I mentioned all the cofactors are involved, which is important. Now, the clinical trials that I just want to mention in brief, you can look them up. They're quite brilliant. They've given us a lot of insights into the omega-3 journey. And they've created a lot of debate and argument, which is great. I love that because we're always asking questions. And one of them is called the Reduce It trial. There's the Strength trial, and then there's the Jealous trial, the Origin trial, the Ascend trial, and the Vital trial. These are all very, very large studies, epidemiological, some randomized control trials. And their outcomes, of course, for the vast majority, they were looking at cardiovascular outcomes, which were, in many cases, amazing. So in the Reduce It trial, there was a 25% relative reduction of cardiovascular events, including stroke, myocardial infarction, and death. So our lifespan was impacted. In the Strength trial, where again it was DHA and EPA, there was fewer reductions cardiovascular. And by looking at the cohort and by understanding that, there was this subgrouping that needs to be done from that trial. We learned from it. We learned to look at different populations differently, looking at backgrounds. So again, great information. And when you consider the totality of information, everything leads to better decision making. The Jealous trial, there was a 19% reduction in coronary events. In the Vital, there was a lower risk of heart attacks by 19%, but it was only in a subset. It wasn't across all the populations that were studied. That's important. Knowing the background of the individual or yourself can help you guide your decisions, and that's kind of what we use these trials to do. Now, there are other amazing outcomes. Neurological, for example, the neurological benefits can be equally as important, although they've been less studied, but we're already seeing in large trials benefits to cognitive decline in the aging populations. Of course, we're seeing it in neurogenesis and neurological benefits in young people. And the story isn't always just, about the taking it and then getting off of it. This is a journey, a lifetime journey. We always want to be including the omega-3 and omega-6 compounds into our diet. It is clearly important for us to do that. We want to make sure we're getting enough of these things into our diet throughout our lifespan. So how do we make choices? How do we determine where we want to benefit whether it be our cardiovascular, preventatively or actively because we have already been diagnosed, or our cognitive decline, or our anxiety, stress, depression, and the like, right? All of these things are choices we have to make, and we have to make them early in life and continue them throughout our lives. And these choices come down to our diet and or supplementation. So we want to look at the fish intake or the shellfish intake. Are there choices we should make in terms of the fish we consume? Absolutely. There are certain fish that are high in omega-3s, and they are essentially safe from contaminants. Now let's talk about contaminants for a minute. At this point in time, we know that we've heard the stories, and of course some have been sensationalized, but mercury tends to be a contaminant issue with fish. And is it ubiquitous? Yeah, there's mercury everywhere, but it bioaccumulates in certain species of fish, especially the large predators, at a much higher level than it does in smaller non-predatory fish. So when you're looking, there are lists, and I have a table that I can provide to you where there are known fish that have much lower levels, and we should be consuming those fish. There are shellfish that have lower levels, and we should be consuming those shellfish. If we're going to supplement, using supplements, we're going to supplement from fish that are the oils that are derived from those fish or those shellfish. That really is the ultimate goal, is the quality of fish, which reduces contaminants like mercury. Likewise, there are now we've known about them emerging in our food supply, in our fish and in our oils, are the dioxins, PCBs, microplastics, and other exogenous contaminants, and they impact our human health. So we need to be aware of those as well as the mercury. And again, there are products that you can get that support the removal of these, or looking at the fish that have lower levels of these, the oils derived from those. It may be filtered. Antioxidants that are either naturally present or added can help protect the oils. And so when we're choosing our fish and we're choosing our supplementation, we're choosing quality DHA, quality EPA, quality ALA. This is true for plant-based oils as well. Not so much the mercury, but it's certainly on the pesticides and the plastics and so on. They exist in the plant world as well as in the marine world. So these are all considerations to make our choices on the effectiveness and the quality of our ingestion of these foods and fish. Either one, I want to recommend both choices. Eating good quality fish, and again, there's a table that shows you the good quality fish that you don't need to avoid, the ones that you should avoid more of, and the ones you absolutely need to avoid. There's also the supplements, quality supplements that contain these levels. At what level do we take? Well, generally speaking, we want to take anywhere from a minimum 500 milligrams of EPA and DHA up to 1.5 grams on a regular basis. I mean, ideally it's daily, but even every other day, we're raising those levels, and you can watch this through blood labs. And so it's an important aspect of managing our levels, and that is going to provide these tools that I've talked about the entire time for the body to make the right choices when there's enough DHA and EPA around. And then we don't do that in a vacuum. We want to make sure that we're living a lifestyle that you live in. I know we're busy. I know that avoid processed foods and ultra-processed foods. Get adequate amounts of micronutrients, the vitamins, the minerals. These absolutely have an impact on the way we process these lipids, and many other lipids, to be clear. And there's also this impact on our microbiome. So omega-3s positively impact our microbiome. So as you're consuming them, whether through food or supplement, we're seeing studies come out showing that our microbiome becomes more diverse. It starts generating different kinds of metabolites, which are beneficial to our immune system. So not only did I cover all of these amazing things that omega-3s do intracellularly or inside of us physiologically, they impact our microbiome, which then generates compounds for our own health. They are themselves impacted by omegas. There's more diversity, as I mentioned. There's more outcome of these metabolites, which means your gut's going to get healthier, and a healthier gut's going to help you metabolize your own food better. And there's a number of publications from many academic sources where we're looking at how the impact of microbiome and omega-3s are both and always have been positive correlations, causation. So this is an amazing outcome. So in summary, and I know I talked about a lot, omega-3s are amazing. Do not avoid them. Do not worry about sensationalism. They are hard to make for some people, especially if you're not consuming enough. They're not easily made from ALA based on your genetics and other impacts like nutrient levels. Homocysteine is another one. They impact essentially every body part through a mechanism that is complex, but yet necessary and absolutely beneficial to us. They impact our microbiome. And in the end, if you choose a good quality supplement and you incorporate into your lifestyle, getting outdoors, getting sunlight, pushing yourself a little bit through, just outdoor exercising, this also drives up the benefits of DHA and EPA, as well as good sleep. And I could go on about that. I'll do another video regarding the nuances that we can do on a daily basis to help benefit our omega-3 intake and omega-6 intake. That being said, I hope I gave you enough information to make an informed decision, and thank you very much.